For those that have joined us online, we're hoping to get our outstanding panelist, Professor Tu, online. It's always a bit of a movable feast with Chinese participants joining us. So we hope he will be able to join us shortly, but I think we should get started. So my name is Peter Draper. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide. And we're hosting today's webinar. We're doing it in partnership with the Trade and Investment Research Network, which is a network that we launched in Geneva last year when we could still travel, with a particular focus on the G20 and the G20's trade and investment agenda, which is the focus of our seminar today, with a particular focus obviously on industrial subsidies. The seminar is based on a Think 20 policy brief that I was a co-author of, that will be presented by Dr. Nisha McDonough, my colleague at the Institute. I should mention that we have a couple of our co-authors online, particularly Professor Andreas Freitag and Professor Henry Gao, and I might rope them in as part-time panelists as the discussion proceeds. Couple of housekeeping matters. Today's conversation is on the record, so we are recording it. It will be uploaded to our website probably in the course of next week. If you want to pose questions or comments, you can use the chat function, or I should say the Q&A function at any time. Because it's a relatively small group, we had about 82 people register for the seminar, but you never quite know how many will join us. Currently, there's just over 30 people online. We might also try to take questions live if people are particularly keen to do so. I would just ask that if you want to do that, that you be disciplined and you be very brief. And we'll give you, particularly if it's a good question, one opportunity to follow up, and then we must move on. So we would like to get a bit more of a dialogue beyond the panel if possible, because we've got some interesting people online that we'd like to bring into the conversation. We are, of course, just a few days away from the G20 summit, which has largely slipped under the media radar screen, I would say. And that's because, of course, of what's been going on in the United States with the post-elections playing out, I guess, of US domestic politics. But the G20, as you know, has a very full agenda, trade and investment, a relatively small part of that. Nonetheless, one big set of issues that is on the G20's agenda is the systemic issues at the heart of the trading system, and particularly with focus on the World Trade Organization. We're particularly pleased to have Tim Yiend with us today, who represents the WTO in those G20 conversations. And we'll turn first to Tim when it comes to the panel discussion. We have a great panel lined up. I'm not going to go through everyone's bios. I'm going to assume they've been read. That'll just give us a bit more time for conversation. So maybe I'll just quickly anchor the conversation by pointing to the Global Trade Alert report, which was released last night. I got it in my inbox this morning. And there is a chapter in there on the growing incidence of industrial subsidies by G20 members. And the figure the GTA comes up with is 717 measures since January this year. They only look at the incidence of measures. They don't measure the impact of the measures or the size of them, to be clear. And I'm sure Ken Ash, who's also one of our panelists today and recently retired from the OECD, will bring us more up to date on some of those more intricate dynamics about the actual issues and measurement of subsidies, of which there are many. But nonetheless, they list 770 measures, mostly non-export related, which doesn't mean that they don't affect exports and export competition. And we'll tease out some of the issues around that in terms of how the G20 members, and particularly the heads of state as they meet, could be focusing more on this topic, and we've got some concrete suggestions to offer in that respect. It is interesting that the GTO report notes that most of those non-export specific measures are firm-specific measures, in other words, targeted at particular companies, and that plays out across a range of sectors. What this brief exposition also shows you is that we're a little bit stabbing in the dark here because we don't have good measurement of industrial subsidies, which of course is part of the problem. So that's by way of broadly introducing the topic. I'll now turn to Dr. Nisha McDonough to talk specifically to the ideas contained in the Think 20 policy brief. Nisha, over to you. Nisha, you need to unmute.
Famous words of 2020. Okay, Peter, thank you very much for that excellent introduction and overview of the issues at hand. So just now bear with me for one moment and I'll share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. Just bear with me for one more moment. All right. All right, so what we're looking at here is essentially, it's a collaboration, today's event between the Institute for International Trade, the T20. Well, the T20 paper is what I'm going to discuss now. And we're doing it with the G20 Trade and Investment Research Network. So the paper is part of the T20 policy brief formulation that was done for the G20 meeting. Happens regularly, and we essentially were concerned with industrial subsidies as a major policy response. Context of that was really looking at it since 2008 and how there was a long-term growth in subsidization, in protectionism, in basically a change in policy sentiment, and really trying to figure out what to do about that from a process perspective and how to change that dynamic. How would you do that from the multilateral level? So as you can see there, the authors include Peter Draper, Andreas Freytag, Henry Gao, myself, and Simon Evenet. All right, so the challenge post-2008, as we noted, the Global Trade Alert has been kind of leading the way in documenting some of the issues at hand here. There was a long-term growth in protectionism. G20 members had actually articulated an anti-protectionist commitment in 2009, and they reiterated that throughout the 2010s, but it wasn't really acted on. The words were often repeated, but the deeds didn't really follow. So we had this extensive growth in policies. Now, it wasn't only the G20 members. Obviously, we're focusing on them, but this was really a global phenomenon. Some of the measurements are quite interesting. So during that decade of the 2010s, G20 members enacted over 14,000 policy interventions favoring domestic firms over foreign rivals. And against that, there were some liberalizing policies, but obviously we can see there was a very significant weighting in favor of protectionism, which of course is the issue at hand. The US-China trade war, of course, dominated the media headlines from around 2017 onwards. But actually, despite the coverage maybe making us intuitively think that since that period, it was responsible for most protection, only 21% of measures from August 2017 were actually due to the trade war. So I think that's important to keep the perspective that this is a global issue. It's a growing issue, and obviously the conditions of the current pandemic are only going to antagonize that sentiment further. And as we're already starting to see and get measures, that isn't indeed the case. So we have a couple of heat maps here, which are very useful to graphically illustrate what happened over that period of time in which we're interested. So here we see 2009. We can see that there's just an intersection of countries, and basically going from green to red, where we're looking at the incidence of trade measures and the percentage of bilateral exports facing importers' trade distortions. So basically, green is good and red is bad. It's a very easy traffic light color system. And we can see for the most part here, we have got green across the board in the relationship between those countries. So that's 2009. So if we jump to 2020, we can immediately see that there's a significant and very extensive change of that coloration to red. What we can also see here is that Japan and Mexico, and to a lesser extent South Korea, have during that period really been the only countries that held off from extensive measures of protectionism. So I thought that was a very graphic and useful illustration. All right, so that's some of the broader context. So in the paper, we were also looking at that there was some of the big players were getting very interested in reforms that would target industrial subsidies, in particular the Trilateral Cooperation, which involved Japan, the EU, and USA. They laid out some WTO reforms in 3 statements, which were publicized starting in 2019, January. I think there was one again mid-year, and there was a 3rd statement again in January of 2020. So they're pretty short statements, but they do cut to the core of what the type of reforms that these major players are looking for. Now, they don't name any particular countries or systems in their reform agenda, but when we have a look at the reforms they're looking for, we'll start to get a sense of who might be targeted here, or at least whose system might most be impacted by this. So the first thing they want to do is expand the list of prohibited subsidies that are already laid out in the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, the ASEM. So they also want to reform in ways that include reversing the burden of proof for very large subsidies. So again, this is very much directed at economic systems that are considered to be opaque, or where information is lacking, or where notifications are lacking. So again, this would be a problem of information asymmetry and an inability to access information. Another point they want to do is insert a clause of serious prejudice to the interests of WTO members. This should be added to Article 6.3 in relation to subsidies that distort capacity. So again, we're looking at major subsidies that have a major consequence for global capacity, yeah? And again, stronger incentives to notify subsidies should be added to Article 25. Again, this is a more general phenomenon. Notification issues are across the board. Something like half of all members are 2 years behind their notification rates, and 1/3 of all members are about 5 years behind. That was in a very recent Bowen and Hillman paper, and that is all available on the WTO website as well. And also in those 3 statements, there was state-owned enterprises were mentioned frequently, and national champions. Again, no specific country measured, but people will be able to read between the lines there. Now, during 2019, China also announced its own reform agenda as formally submitted to the WTO in May 2019. So some of the issues here kind of pulling in a slightly different direction, we can see. So expand the list of non-actionable subsidies. That was one of the recommendations. Again, also improve trade remedy rules, improve rules on security exceptions to prevent misuse. Again, so trade war, think about the trade war there, and the application of national security by the US in particular has been very prevalent in using that type of approach. Tighten rules on unilateral measures which are inconsistent with WTO rules. So again, the experience of the trade war is probably filtering into China's proposals here. And also another interesting one would be eliminate developed countries AMS. So that's the aggregate measure of support entitlements for agricultural subsidies. So these are some of the core policies. There's more detail in it than that, but I won't go into all that detail here. What I can do is provide a kind of, this is a synthetic overview of both the reform agendas. I color coded to show where they're diverging and converging. As you can see, there's not a lot of convergence there, but there is a lot of divergence. So these are diametrically opposed reform agendas. by the key players, really, the players that we have to get on board if we want to see any sorts of reforms. So they've both laid down the kind of paths towards reform that they want. And as I said, obviously, they're pulling in different directions. All right, so for really what we want to do is get to a landing zone. So there's a couple of points. So with the brief, we set out the context, we set out the issues at hand, really some of the stats I've given you there, the growth and protectionism, the issues also that are occurring with the WTO. We're in a stalemate at the moment. Obviously, the appellate body is in a deep freeze, which is also crucial if you're going to be taking any cases using the dispute settlement understanding. So even though that's already faulty, obviously you can't take cases if the appellate body is out of operation, or at least you can take a case, but you'll never get a resolution. Also within the WTO ASCM, cases are taken up to 16 years, as we know with Boeing and Airbus. So they're inordinately long. So obviously significant reform has to occur. And we were thinking about then what would be a process. So what would be a political economic process by which we could get these groups together? Some sort of constructive dialogue would start occurring. What would we do? What would be the type of processes? So the G20 should establish a subsidies reform subcommittee. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a moment. To stay connected to an eventual WTO reform agenda, there needs to be intra-G20 meetings should be replicated in Geneva. And also these talks need to be based on an establishment of core principles to guide negotiations. All right, so that's the last slide. I'll stop sharing and I'll just briefly talk another 2-3 minutes on those, and then I'll be done and we can go to the discussants. All right, so let's get to the first one, the G20 subcommittee. So what we're thinking about here, this should be a subsidies reform committee comprising senior trade and finance ministry officials. These officials will be required to cover the trade and industrial policy as well as financial and broader economic policy dimensions of subsidies, particularly in the current era as well. These are going to be very important people to have at the table. The committee's scope would have to be broad, right? We need to have a broad enough discussion beyond subsidies per se to widen the scope for trade-offs. We also need to think about this as a long-term issue. It should be multi-year because it's going to take years of dialogues to work through the many complex and the politically sensitive issues that this is going to raise. Whether this committee should report only to trade ministers, given the broader economic considerations at hand, and also given the role that subsidies play in legitimate social goals, we need to consider that quite carefully. Now, moving on to the mirroring part in Geneva, the meetings of these capital-based officials should be mirrored, as we said, through regular meetings of G20 members based in the WTO delegations. Now, the point of this is to keep that dialogue linked to broader WTO reform discussions. It'll also allow informal channels to be maintained with non-G20 WTO members to establish a landing zone. And also there'll be members who are interested in this discussion who are not members of the G20 and will have a stake in the dialogue. Okay, so just lastly, the core principles. So, I mean, some of the issues with the WTO at the moment is really a loss of a normative commitment to the system, and what are the core principles around which the multilateral system should be based. So we really feel it's an important part of this to establish core principles to guide negotiations. These will be required because of the contestation and the divergent understandings of what the problems are and what needs to be done. So a number of these principles we think should, the focus on subsidies, for example, that have the potential to generate negative, very large cross-border spillover effects on trading partners. We think allowance should be made for subsidies designed to achieve legitimate social and policy objectives, as I mentioned a moment ago. Principles of competitive neutrality. So I think this is one that's going to be very interesting to discuss as a core principle. So this requires the application of subsidy payments have minimal distorting effects on market competition, particularly in relation to cross-border business. G20 governments should agree on the need for disciplined caps on the growth of subsidies, including entitlements governing agricultural subsidies. There needs to be a consensus on principles governing special and differential treatment or the access of countries at different stages of development to subsidies entitlements. So now we see overlap with another major issue of discussion at the WTO, and the rules governing national defense using trade remedies against negative cross-border spillovers arising from subsidies needs to be clarified. So again, this is the national security exception that China has raised. So these would be some of the core principles we thought should be important, and I'm happy to leave it there.
Thanks very much, Nisha, for setting out the store, so to speak. I'd now like to turn to Tim Yee to provide a response from the WTO's perspective. Tim.
Hey, thanks very much, Peter. And it's good to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate, and hi to my fellow panelists and everyone listening in. And thanks obviously to Nisha for a very interesting presentation. I think, look, it's great to be having this discussion at the moment. As has been pointed out, the G20 summit is coming up at the end of this week. Trade and investment issues always feature prominently. Unfortunately, they always feature as being about the last issue resolved in any communique of the G20. And I'd have to say that issues related to trade this year, I know it is all a little bit under the radar screen, but certainly I think there'll be quite a solid outcome on trade and investment issues. Obviously, the trading system is facing extremely challenging times, none the more because of the pandemic and the dramatic effect that it's had on public health, global trade, economic activity. And I think one of the things that's come out from the pandemic, and there's already been reference to, is the huge increase in economic support measures that we've seen. And that has had the effect of people starting to think again about this question of subsidisation, government support. Some of it, of course, is fully justified, but some of it can have trade impacts. How do we deal with that issue? It's not a new issue, and I'm sort of going to focus my comments sort of both on what's been happening at the WTO and then finish with a bit of a commentary on the G20 and its work. But the question of industrial subsidies has been there for a long time. It was part of the Doha round. Unfortunately, not much came out of that, and it's quite right that it's in the last couple of years through, I think, the focus the G20 has put on the issue as part of the reform set of issues, and things like the tripartite work being done by the EU, US and Japan that have put attention on the issue again. It's very politically sensitive and complex, but I think at the WTO, there's been sort of a couple of things that I think have, could bear some fruit. One is around the question of transparency and notifications, where it's quite right that members are not living up to their obligations. There really is work to be done there, but there are some interesting ideas on the table about how you might improve that. And I think that's low-hanging fruit that could really be looked at as something that would make a difference. More transparency would really help to shine a spotlight on some of the support that we're seeing. The other issues, and there are the issues that Nisha went through from the Trilateral paper about definitional questions, reversing burdens of proof, things like that. These are very, very complex, and they're not necessarily all new ideas. And yeah, we do need to find the right way to take a discussion like that forward. That's where I can come to the G20. And this is just based on my own personal experience, where the real value of the G20 on the trade and investment agenda, in my view, has been the political momentum that the G20 has put behind the issue of WTO reform. In fact, we we wouldn't have this general support now for WTO reform if not for the efforts of the G20 and G20 leaders starting in Buenos Aires 3 years ago. And so that has been backed up by the work going on in the Trade and Investment Working Group. But one thing that you have to sort of realise is that all the differences of view that exist in the WTO are to a large extent also present in the G20. So it's not necessarily that by going to the G20, particularly when you start to dig down into the weeds, that you're going to overcome those kind of problems. So this comes to just some of the, I mean, I think that the paper's idea about doing this work in the G20 is very interesting, but I do have a couple of questions and things about the way the G20 operates that I think would need to be sort of taken into consideration. One, for instance, is that in situations where there is a proposal to do work, the G20's default view is, well, where should it be done? What's the right organisation? What's the right place to do that? So you're going to have to answer that question: why the G20? And a good example is the issue of excess capacity, steel excess capacity. The G20 identified that as an issue, but it asked the OECD to do it. And I think on the question of industrial subsidies, the default that many people would think the place to have that discussion is at the WTO. And then the other, I've already referred, how do you get some of the members of both WTO and G20 that are likely to be opposed to this kind of discussion? Because I think you're going to face that problem no matter where you try to do it. Now, one other last thing I just put out there, because I know time is limited, is, well, are there other possible ways to move forward? And I think in any way forward, the G20 can play an extremely helpful role in advocacy and looking at particular issues and doing particular things. But one other phenomenon that we've seen in Geneva in the last couple of years is these so-called like-minded initiatives. There's currently one on electronic commerce, one on investment facilitation, and a number of others as well. Anyone who wants to participate, but not everyone has to participate. And as a result of that, you've had these discussions that really have shown a lot of life, because it's only the countries that want to make progress that are involved in the discussions. And it's not just a handful of countries. It's been, we're talking 70. I think investment facilitation is 106. I think electronic commerce is in the 70s in terms. So it's a substantial part of the membership. So one thought I have is, and I know some people have been thinking of this, is that the area around subsidies, industrial subsidies, would be another prime candidate for that kind of approach. Now, the first question people say, but would China, and I think Nish has already said a lot of this is focused on China, would China participate? And I think that's a very good open question. But China has participated in all of these other like-minded initiatives. And in my view, I think China's view is quite often that it's better to be involved in a discussion than not to be involved in a discussion and see everything sort of be decided by others. So what as another possible sort of path, I just wonder about this kind of joint statement initiative, as they call it, this like-minded path, as a way to start building support for the discussion. Because I think the key thing at the moment is there is no discussion in Geneva on these issues apart from transparency and notifications. So they're just, I might leave it there, but they're just some initial thoughts. And thanks again for giving me the opportunity, and certainly look forward to the discussion and hearing from others. Thanks, Peter.
Well, thanks very much, Tim. Some interesting thoughts there. I'm sure we're going to pick up on them in the conversation. I'd now like to turn to Dr. Stormy Anneke-Mildner to get a perspective from business, German business particularly, but I think Stormy has a broader view than that, and certainly an interest in this debate. Stormy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for organizing this event, which I think is extremely timely. And I couldn't agree more that the G20 summit and the preparations are a little bit below the radar, at least in the general public and in the media, not so much in business and not so much among policymakers. I just had the opportunity last week to talk to our chancellery about this, and they were not so super optimistic on some trade issues. And we were kind of hoping that the tone might have changed after the US elections. Apparently that's not so much the case, and it's so fundamental. And if I compare this to the German G20 presidency and what at that time was still possible on trade issues, I mean, it's really a different world now we are living in. If the language and the fight about the language in the G20 text is now about if we mention the WTO at all within the central of the multilateral trading system, I really, really hope that this is going to change under a Biden administration, and that the WTO is going to get its due space, again, also in the statements, which it really deserves, as it is also from the German business point of view, but also from the business trendy point of view, in which I'm a part, is the pillar, the center of a rules-based multilateral trading system with regard to rules setting, with regard to enforcement, with regard to notification and trade dispute settlement. It has its problems, that's for sure, but it's really, really the best thing we have. And instead of, whenever I hear, let's design something completely new, I just say never ever. I mean, we have something which really has worked so well, and we should work on making it even better. So let me come to the issue of industrial subsidies. So as Tim has already said, and Peter and your colleagues, industrial subsidies are really nothing new. But they are on the move. We see more of them, although it is a little hard to measure them, because I mean, there's little data out there. And Peter, you said it earlier, with regard to trade alert, it's even more difficult to calculate the effects of a subsidy. I mean, how big is the trade distortion really? But if we take countervailing measures as a proxy, as a careful proxy, then we can definitely assume that industrial subsidies are on the move. And when I'm looking at economic stimulus packages now during the economic crisis and the Corona crisis, I also very clearly see that there are a lot of new subsidies. And while that is absolutely okay and necessary to stabilize our economies, we need to do this right now. Just looking at the aviation sector, it needs to be done. History has also shown that it's hard to take subsidies away when they are once given, because they create a vested interest, you know, all this. So it becomes even more relevant to deal with the issues of subsidies. And it's not just an emerging economy or China issue, it will also be a big issue for all of us. And we see that with the Airbus-Boeing case. We also grant subsidies, the United States and the EU, and it makes a lot of sense to have a better mechanism to take to really notify subsidies, to see what we are doing, and maybe also putting a cap on it. So if I'm looking at the WTO, I so much agree with your with the paper you put out and with your presentation that the WTO has a rule book, but it's rather vague on subsidies. Subsidies are pretty vaguely defined. The definition is pretty limited, especially taking into account also the entities which can grant subsidies. So the public body debate. But not only this, the hurdles to really use countervailing measures are also pretty high, right? So the complainant bears the burden of proof and has to show that there has been really an injury, and that injury which was suffered is really also due to subsidies. And that in itself, I mean, is a good thing, that the company or the country which has been affected needs to show this, but it becomes really tricky if you're dealing with markets which are opaque. and if you're dealing with state-owned enterprises, which are opaque. So that is definitely a problem, the burden of proof. Another one is, and you mentioned this before as well, is the notification of disciplines and also the data on disciplines. So what needs to be done? Both BDI, Federation of Germany, as well as the Business 20, we put out some recommendations which are very, very close to what you also recommended. We very much support the proposals of the Trilateral initiative. And but maybe one disclaimer before, because I think it's important to mention. So countervailing duties and also a different anti-subsidy agreement, may it be plurilateral or multilateral, is not going to be the silver bullet as it is often discussed right now, because it does not address the unlevel playing field caused by subsidies in third markets, and it does also not address the issue of government procurement or the issue of investment. And that is, I'm saying this because in our debate, at least here at home, a lot of times everything is kind of thrown into one basket. And what is proposed is that you use one instrument to counter a problem in another policy field. And I'm very skeptical about this. I think we need to remain rules oriented and address the problems which we see with the policy instruments which fit to it. So I think while we do need also discuss government procurement access problems and unlevel playing field, this requires a different policy tool, and countervailing duties should not be used for this. And that's why we believe it's a good move of the European Commission that it put out a white paper on an anti-subsidy instrument which addresses these issues and doesn't try to mix it up too much. So what are the recommendations, or what would we like to see? We would certainly like to see better data, and Ken is here, and I'm sure that the OECD is already working on it. It would be great if the G20 would commission the OECD, WTO, and maybe another institution in there as well, the UNCTAD, to put out the data. I'm not so sure if the G20 is going to do this. Also taking into account what Tim said with regard to the overcapacity forum, the steel forum on overcapacity. I don't know if the appetite for more transparency is so high in all countries, but it would be a great initiative. So better data. I very much agree with Tim that to work on the notification and enforcement in the WTO would be great. And the EU proposal offers a way forward, I think, and it should be taken up. And I hope that there will be a new momentum with the Biden administration. We would like to see a broader definition of subsidies as proposed by the Trilateral initiative. We would also like to have a discussion if the burden of proof could be maybe even reversed, but if that is not possible, then at least facilitated through, I mean, the EU has done a China report, for example, which can be used by companies to make it easier to prove that there are distortions in the market and that China is not a market economy. We would also like to see that anti-dumping cases and anti-subsidy cases are more often done in parallel because they have they are a lot of times interlinked. And last but not least, I know that this is a little controversial, but I think it would make sense to have a debate if countervailing measures cannot be extended to the service sector. And I'm saying this because a lot of industrial goods trade will not be industrial goods trade in the future anymore, but services trade. Now, I don't know what the Corona crisis is doing to the servicification of the industrial sector, because some models have also proven not very profitable, like in the aviation industry, where you do not sell the turbines anymore, but you kind of sell the time in the air of a turbine. So that really put a damper damper on income for the aviation industry during the Corona crisis. So I don't know if that is really going to be the model of the future. There will be definitely changes, but apart from this, I nonetheless think that because of digitalization, the service sector is on the forerun. We will see more services trade and probably also more distortion in trade and services, and we need to address that too. So let me close by saying, whenever we extend such an instrument, we also need to be watchful not to go too far. Because countervailing measures can also be used as a measure of protectionism. We know this, just as anti-dumping measures can also be used as protectionism. So there also need to be limits to it. But having said this, your proposals are wonderful, and thank you so much again to you and your teammates for organizing this event.
Thanks very much, Stormy. That was a rich set of ideas, many threads that we could pick up on. Just to note on services that obviously the WTO's rules on subsidies to services are underdeveloped, let's just put it that way. Tim might want to pick up on that later. So that's quite an intriguing idea you put on the table there. But let me turn now to Professor Tu from the University of International Business and Economics, who's joined us online to give us a perspective from Beijing. Professor Tu, over to you.
It's just my personal view. Thank you, Peter. I very much agree with the proposals in the policy brief. There are 2 points which are particularly valuable, I think. The first is that the focus should be put on those subsidies creating negative cross-border spillover effect. The second is some subsidies should be considered permissible if they have specific legitimate social and economic purposes. The COVID-19 pandemic showed that an effective government could be very positive and necessary. Of course, there are a lot of market failures and public goods in need of government interventions. So I think we need more comprehensive and maybe more courageous economic studies to redefine the appropriate roles of government and market. We cannot depend on the market totally, at least. But the urgent issue is to modify and clarify the definition and the classification of subsidies based on national practices and relevant economic and legal analysis. But one precondition is to have full information of subsidies of members. Then the difficulty rests in the poor implementation of notifications. However, I suppose one reason for incomplete notification is that members fear to be challenged since under the current WTO rules, all subsidies are actionable. So nobody is sure that the notified subsidies will not create some problems, create some difficulty for themselves or bring some disputes to themselves. Therefore, members will tend to refuse to notify or postpone notifying their subsidies or only partly notify their subsidies. So actually, we have done small research on US notifications of subsidies. We found that many subsidies challenged in WTO disputes or countervailed by other members are not properly notified. So actually, other members found these subsidies from other channels, not from notifications of the United States. Of course, I don't think this is unique to the US. Other countries will also do like this. Actually, the US is already very good at least periodically submit notifications. Many members don't submit at all. So, so I'm afraid that there's a kind of dilemma here. While we need full notification in order to make a complete analysis and the classification, members don't want to do that because there is no clear classification of permissible subsidies. So they're afraid that their notifications, as I said, could create some problems for themselves. So, so my idea is that the first priority is to reach an agreement on the definition and classification of subsidy first. Based on the available information from the notifications and also from dispute cases and also from these countervailing duty cases of members. So I think there are a lot of there's a lot of information already there. And based on this information, I think the academic discussions could go first. Before a political consensus, we first need an academic consensus first. Actually, I think there are not only different ideas among governments, there are also different ideas among scholars. And as I said, actually, there has been a debate, right, on what role the government should play, or what is the role of the market. What's the how to say, the boundary between government and the market? It's always a big problem. So of course, subsidies is not only one question in terms of the division between government and the market, but it is really a very important one. So I think, as I said, based on those available information, the academic could go first to do more deeper and comprehensive studies to clarify what subsidies are, what subsidies have negative cross-border spillover effects, what are not, what subsidies are not, have no such kind of effects. So actually, there are already some initiatives which Peter is always involved in. So I think you know all of these. I think, and also I think G20 could be a good platform to do that, because G20 could report to the G20 more directly. So then the G20, of course, I think subsidies are mainly given by those big economies, because small economies usually don't have enough money to give subsidies. So then I think the G20 is really a relevant platform to discuss, to study the issue of subsidies. Another thing is, shall we focus only on industrial subsidies? Why don't we talk about agricultural subsidies? What are the difference? Actually, agriculture is also an industry, right? Depending how you define it. So I think there are still some similarities between industrial subsidies and agricultural subsidies. And also in terms of the classification, I think the so-called traffic light approach is workable for both agriculture and industrial subsidy. Right now, like export subsidies in agriculture are also prohibited, right? So there are no, there are no very big difference between agriculture and the industrial subsidies. So I don't think, and also services. Of course, there are some differences. I mean, in terms of the ways of provision of subsidies, but in terms of economic and the social effects, I don't think there is a big difference among those three types of subsidies in three industries. So yeah, this is my remark. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Xinhuan. Again, a rich set of ideas, particularly the idea of firmly classifying industrial subsidies into an agreement on agriculture type of modality with different boxes. So I guess on the non-actionable side, you'd be advocating the creation of a green box, where certain subsidies, say COVID-19 related subsidies, would receive a tick. You could implement them, presumably under certain conditions, and all member states would be free to do so. I particularly liked your idea of the academic consensus first. Good for us, academic institutions. We should be involved in those conversations. But before we get to that, I now want to turn, last but by no means least, to Ken Ash, who's worked for many, many years on these issues from the vantage point of the OECD. Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Just a couple of comments. Generally speaking, I think we're at risk of an agreement breaking out amongst the discussants. I think there's a lot of common view. Your brief is terrific, and Nisha, thank you for that presentation. As others have said, this is a particularly timely conversation. Not that subsidies are new, they're not. There's certainly more of them over the last decade. And whether they're subsidies or something that people prefer to call support, a massive share of global GDP is being spent proportionally by governments to keep the economic machinery running. And this is absolutely necessary. But equally necessary, looking a little bit further down the road, some of that support needs to stop, and governments need to get out of the business of doing what businesses should be doing. Good that there's lots of support at the moment, but moving away from that when conditions are appropriate is equally important. So this topic, not just because of the G20 and possibly G7 conversations that will happen over the next few months, is incredibly important. But as Tim has said, all of this at some point needs to come back, whatever the plurilateral grouping, to something closer to a multilateral arrangement, and the WTO is the obvious place for that to happen. There's essentially two things, I think, here that we should untangle a little bit. And I'm not going to say anything new. I'm just going to say the same things differently. There's the issue of transparency, and there's the issue of impact of subsidies. With respect to transparency, there isn't much. What we know about subsidies, both the stock that's been in place for 30, 40 years, changed in many sectors very little. The more recent flow since the financial crisis, which has been enormous, but will be dwarfed by the amount of support we see today in a COVID and a coexisting with COVID environment. So developing information on the nature and the scale of subsidies in place today, whether they were introduced last month, last year, or 20 years ago, is incredibly important. I'm not going to give you any numbers except one with respect to how pervasive subsidies are. So where I used to work at the OECD, we measure and have done for 30 years subsidies to agriculture, amongst many other things. So last year, they were in the vicinity of $750 billion US, fully 2/3 of which are in excess of $500 billion US, were highly distortive, both of production decisions on farms and consequently on markets and trade. One of the things that's different, and I think Professor Tu asked a very good question, what's different about agriculture versus industrial sectors? Fundamentally nothing, but there is one difference, and that is in agriculture, we have an incredible amount of transparency with respect to subsidies. So I can give you those numbers. I don't have a corresponding number for industrial sectors. I can give you a snapshot of what's going on in the steel sector, in the aluminum value chain, in semiconductors, in fossil fuels, in fisheries, but comprehensive information globally doesn't exist. And in my view, this is where we have to start. What is happening? So before you can discipline, you need to understand what's happening, who pays, and who benefits, and we don't have that information yet. Which brings me to the second part, the second point I wanted to make. In addition to transparency, we don't know enough about the impact of measures. And one of the things we do know, I think we know this, and if it's a personal view, then okay, it's a personal view. I don't think we can count on countries notifying in a timely manner. I mean, the number that I have in my head comes from Bernard Hoekman at the EUI, that roughly 10% of WTO members have met their commitments to notify. 10%. Obviously, lots of them have the capacity to notify; they choose not to. So what's the default? But what happens when a country doesn't notify? Well, not much. So replacing that not much with an alternative source of information on subsidies. So whether that's within the WTO or outside of the WTO, but surely the consequence of not providing information should be something closer to, well, that information will be provided by others. And it can be reviewed, it can be verified, it can be corrected, it can be adjusted. But it seems to me if we say, well, okay, you will not provide information, here is what we understand the information to be, and then you show me that is wrong. That's a different kind of reversal of proof, but finding a way to not just rely on countries to self-notify, but to generate information that's a bit more comprehensive is, to me, an incredibly important first step. With that information, then you can do analytics to distinguish good subsidies from bad subsidies, because there are good reasons for the public sector to invest in facilitating innovation, in ensuring skills and providing essential infrastructure, both hard and soft. So there's many good ways to spend money, but there's also many ways to spend money such that markets are distorted and you don't have competitive neutrality. And I don't know of any shortcuts to that other than, roll up your sleeves, first identify the subsidy, regardless of its goal or its intended or its assumed impact. It's not obvious to me, Peter, that any subsidy given in the name of COVID is good. Let's look at that subsidy. It's intended to be good, I'm sure, but let's look at it and its incidence and its actual impact. One question, of course, which we won't get into today very much, I don't suppose, but I mean, who benefits from the trillions of dollars that have been spent in a COVID response? Is it businesses that would have failed anyway? Is it big businesses? Is it small businesses that simply need to be tided over? And what about consumers? And what about poor households? I mean, what is the distributional impact of this spending? Because I think there's a lot of research out there that suggests, early stage research that suggests that we're going to increase inequalities within countries over the course of the activities, as a result of the activities over the past and the next few months. So I think there's a great deal to do, both in job number one, improving transparency, and job number two, distinguishing good versus bad subsidies, including the distribution of those impacts. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ken. So a reminder to the non-panelists, our guests, that you're welcome to pose questions or comments through the Q&A. We've got a couple, including one through the chat. As I mentioned, we do have a couple of our co-authors online, one of whom is also on the steering committee of the Trade and Investment Research Network. And I'd actually like to ask him, that's Professor Andreas Freitag, to provide a brief intervention, which he can do online if Lisa can enable him to do so. So let's turn quickly to Andreas. And I should mention that I'm not going to wait a long time for the tech to work. But here he comes.
Well, I have just been promoted. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Hello, Peter. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you also for this really interesting panel. I enjoyed the contributions very much. I would like to pick up a couple of points, if I may. One is about transparency. We know and Stormy will know this, in Germany for more than 20 years, the Kiel Institute is providing very good information about the level and amount of subsidies paid in Germany on all levels, from the European level down to the municipality level. And here my obvious question, what is the amount of subsidies paid in Germany? It's about 200 billion euros in 2019. So it's quite a substantive amount of money. So that means it's not only China who is the culprit here, it's a long-standing problem. And I was wondering whether one can apply such technology like the Kiel people are doing, and I'm happy to send it around, and you can download it from the Kiel Institute's website, whether this technology can be applied for other countries as well, as a question to Ken in particular. And then I would like to make another point, which has been mentioned indirectly, but not directly here so very clearly. Subsidies also distort the domestic economy. And I think this would be extremely important, and this is our task, I think, as academics, to calculate these distortive effects, to show the governments that it is not in the national interest to pay subsidies to that extent. Yeah? So this would change the mindset from they hurt us to we hurt ourselves, which is probably much worse than what the others do to us. And there is not enough evidence, at least not enough clear evidence. There was, again, back in the 80s, there were a lot of studies looking at this, at the distortive effects of subsidies for the domestic economies, but I think we should catch up and do this for the current period. And that's what I wanted to say. Thanks, Peter, for promoting me, and now I must go back to the rank and file.
Well, I demote you. Yes, thank you, Andreas. So, Stormy, I think that was a question or a comment to you, and then Ken. And perhaps on your last point, I'll invite Professor Tu and perhaps Tim to respond on that. Nisha, we'll come back to you right at the end. Ken. Stormy, so you first.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, Andreas, I very much agree that could be a good approach. I think it's a little bit of a question of political will, and where there is a will, there is a way. And I don't know if countries would follow that Kiel approach. Maybe can say more about this. What I really liked about our discussion is that we need to look very careful at the effects of a subsidy. Not every subsidy is a bad subsidy. Not everything what we now might call a subsidy is actually, I mean, we have to draw a clear distinction, if that's possible, between research and development funds, which are also good for economic growth, for development, for jobs, and so on, and those which are really distortive. I think we need to distinguish between those which have only a domestic effect, although I would say because of our global value chains, many, if not most, have a cross-border effect, but I still agree there's a distinction which we have to draw. And one thing, I mean, I actually wanted to ask a question also to Tim and to Ken, because what I was wondering about, why there has been so little progress in the Trilateral Initiative since it put out the proposal a year ago. And my suspicion is that it's the same reason why the countries are a little hesitant in the end to notify, because we are, and it might be the Europeans here being on the break, and I would like to hear if that is a suspicion which is correct. We are afraid that some of the things we are currently doing or planning to do under the Green Deal and some other industrial policy initiatives might become actionable in the future. And that's something which I wanted to hear your opinion on, Tim and Ken.
Great, so let's go to Ken. That's two questions now, Ken, and then we'll go to Tim.
Okay, thanks a lot. So The technology can be applied, I'm sure. Stormy is right as well, I am sure. Political will is kind of a little bit sort of too general. We kind of hide behind that quite often, but countries know what they do. Countries can share that information or not. And I think the answer is they will not, whatever the motivations. So somebody else has to do it. And I guess that's where I've come after however many years I've been doing this. That there has to be somebodies that fill that gap. I agree completely. We hurt ourselves as much as others hurt us, both directly but also indirectly. I think we need to reinvigorate the notion of opportunity costs. So if governments spend a lot of money on making businesses do things they would at home that they would otherwise not do, then where's the money coming from for the necessary education, for the necessary investments in health, for the necessary infrastructure, for putting broadband throughout the country, and so on? We hurt ourselves. We can hurt ourselves by misallocating domestic resources, but we can also take money from good things and put it on bad things, and surely that has to stop. The argument applies, by the way, equally to border measures. Import restrictions, they hurt the domestic economy more than they do, the trading partner that's been blocked, because if businesses can't get at it, and consumers can't get at the best price and best quality, then this is not good for anybody. Interesting hypothesis, Stormy, on the trilateral. I have no idea what goes on behind those doors. But, I'll just say one thing. Trying to add transparency to subsidies and understand better the impact, there's one truth I've learned. And Stormy, that's my subsidies are good and your subsidies are bad.
All righty, thanks, Ken. let's turn to Tim. Any insights, Tim, into the trilateral?
Well, I'm not involved, a bit like Ken. I'm sort of watching, and the rest of you are watching from the outside. But on the trilateral, the point I would make is that to get where they've gotten to, it's taken twice as long as they had been planning. So the statement, I think the most recent statement put out in January was about 12 or 18 months later than they had initially been planning. And so what I do know is that there's a lot, even amongst those three countries, there's huge areas of disagreement. And then if you look at, the so-called gaps we're talking about, the problems with the definition, et cetera, why is the subsidies agreement like that? It's because back in the 1990s, the EU and the US couldn't agree. So it just sort of shows the complexity of the issue. I can only speculate that some of the reasons Stormy set out as to why there's hesitancy from some of the players, that sounds right to me as well, because I think that everyone's wanting to keep a certain amount of space for things they may be wanting to do, and this is the inherent problem we face. I'd like just to come back to this question of transparency, because I think it is it's a critical issue. We do need to get more data out there, to look at the effects of subsidies. And I agree, places like the OECD and the WTO need to be empowered to be able to do that kind of work. But therein lies a problem, because whenever there's an effort, whether it's like some of the proposals from the EU and some other countries, including Australia, for instance, is to give the WTO Secretariat more of an ability to pursue research of these economic support measures, do some more looking and digging down, and that's something that you would think there'd be no problem with, but actually it's strongly contested by a number of WTO members that this is not the role of the Secretariat to delve down and look into those kind of things. So I come back to, I think this question of transparency, getting the data out there, doing some sort of exposing some of the problems is absolutely critical. And in addition to, yes, try and get an academic consensus around some of these issues, I really think we need to find a way of getting some work going on in the right institutions. And here it's definitely the WTO Secretariat. So certainly the proposals that have been put on the table by various members, I think, are showing that there is a possible path forward. And I really think that, you know, just taking things a step at a time, that would be a really good place to start for putting pressure. Let's just get better systems in place to get data, to improve transparency. And I think that's something that can be done in the short term, as opposed to some of the other issues. I think we need a longer work plan, and it's going to be a lot more complex to get where we need to get.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tim. Very interesting. Maybe just to mention, I'm sure the panel knows this, but for our attendees, the World Bank is conducting substantive work on these issues as well. And they do seem to have a mandate to do so, or maybe in the nature of these things, they've appropriated a mandate. I'm not sure, but the point is they are conducting quite an extensive analytical exercise on the incidence of subsidization, going towards definitions, et cetera, unfortunately, there in Washington, we have to work in 2 time zones. Being based in Australia, we can't work in 3. But I think for our next subsidies-focused webinar, we will certainly want to link in with the World Bank and get an update on what they're doing. But I quickly wanted to pose a question to Professor Tu, and this draws on something that Ken had said, but it also references what Professor Tu had said, which is, Shin Kwan Yu had said we need an academic consensus. And you'd said that that should also precede the policy or agreements consensus, the negotiations consensus. And that made me think about how the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures first emerged in the absence, I would have thought, of a lot of credible data. And that tells me that it is possible to design something. Now, it would be a lot better with the data on the table for sure. And I'm an exponent of getting the data analysis out there and the core underlying data, obviously. But I don't think that should stop us from trying to bring some definition and precision, at least to the analytical concepts that could go to frame an eventual agreement. And I wondered if Tu might have something to say about that.
Yes, just as I said, probably for now, we cannot have full information of subsidies, but at least in terms of like types of subsidies, I think we have enough information. We have known, right, how the governments will subsidize the companies, and actually the nature or the classification will be largely dependent on this, right? The approaches. So as I said, I think the academia could do some job on this. But I just want to add one point to Andre's point about we should evaluate the domestic impact of subsidies, because actually this is now a big problem in China. Although there is increasingly strong surveillance or auditing on government spending, but there are rare evaluations on the impact or effectiveness of subsidies. Basically, no. So after the government give out their money, then that's it. Towards evaluations. Also, as Ken said, the intentions are possibly nice, but the actual outcome could be the opposite. So this is there's a huge waste of money. So this is also actually there is a very hot debate in China, inside China, about whether the government should subsidize these so-called emerging industries, like new energy cars. Because the development of new energy cars in China, this industry is not so good, at least. So This could distort the market, but also hurt the national welfare. But as I know, the Chinese government is trying to do that. They are collecting information, but not open to us. So, of course, this is an internal or domestic process, but I think the WTO or the G20 could provide a kind of platform for sharing some best practices. Probably the EU has done this very well, and also the US, or as you said, maybe the World Bank has done such kind of job already. So I think the WTO or G20 maybe could launch some initiative to share these practices.
Great, thanks, Ridwan. So we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, which I'm going to answer through typing, because I think they lend themselves to that. There are a couple of questions in the chat that I did want to quickly bring out or draw to the panelists' attention. So the first, you can read this yourselves, I think, in the chat, but from Philip Reinhold, is how do the participants see the recent attempt of the EU with regard to the regulation of foreign subsidies? And he mentions countervailing duty specifically. And can unilateral measures play a role in bringing parties to the negotiating table? So I'm not sure who might want to pick up on that question. Possibly Stormy would have something to say about that. So I might pick on you, Stormy, first of all.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that question again, or maybe Peter, you can help me. The question is the current attempts on the EU on foreign direct investment screening. No,
so it's really a question about unilateral measures designed to bring parties to the negotiating table. So if the EU wants to promote discussions on reforms to industrial subsidies, by raising the costs for, say, China to pay subsidies, is that a good approach and a good instrument? That's my interpretation of the question.
Okay, so it's a little bit of a larger debate, and it comes under the heading of the concept of open strategic autonomy. I mean, and it brings us to economic coercion. I think it's a really wide topic. And under this header, the European Commission is currently conducting several consultations on its trade policy, on subsidies. That's the white paper I mentioned earlier, but also on border adjustments. And it is reviewing a lot of instruments, including anti-dumping, countervailing measures. It is also looking again at investment screening, but also government procurement with the IPI, the government procurement instrument. And then it is currently also discussing something which is called the anti-coercion mechanism or instrument, with which to address all sorts of coercion abroad. And one thing I forgot to mention, the overhaul of the enforcement regulation of the EU. So we are currently in a big debate of how much we need to readjust the EU policy instruments to ensure a level playing field. And I think this is good, but it also raises some questions and it also comes with some dangers because we have seen in the EU for quite a while a rise in protectionist sentiment. It's become ever so more difficult to pass free trade agreements, to sign free trade agreements and pass them. And there is really a move away from the market mechanism to state intervention. And especially now during the COVID crisis, it's kind of the time of the state. And in addition, some of the ideas on the table might also lead to counteractions abroad, which might also hurt us. So when I look at the concept, I would always emphasize the open and the strategic. I have my problems with the autonomous or sovereignty in there, because I think we have always benefited so much from open markets, investment, but also trade, obviously. And that is something which we should guard against protectionism. At the same time, we need to talk about, we need to ensure a level playing field, and we need to revision these instruments. What the Commission really needs to do is talk to other countries, because some of the things we have in petto are really, could be rather aggressive. The border adjustment mechanism, for example. That is something we really need to discuss in the G20, but also with the United States. It's really something which needs to be well prepared and well designed, and the anti-coercion mechanism just as well. If it's really coming and the European Parliament has a great interest in it, we really need to talk to our trading partners. So I hope that answers the question.
I think it does, Stormy. It was a great answer. So Ken quickly wanted to pose a question. I'll just remind the panelists we've got about 7 minutes left, and I want to give about 3 minutes to Nisha to wrap up. Ken.
2 points very briefly, if I could, on this unilateral issue. I think big countries can force others to the table. The other 190 countries in the world probably cannot. On a quick question for Stormy, if there's time, Peter. Stormy doesn't have subsidies, I don't have subsidies, but countries tend to regard what they do as well-intentioned and good, and what others do as mischievous and bad. And so trying to unpack that. But Stormy, is it possible for businesses to do more to help analysts and governments understand the impact of what they do on their part in the economy? So is there something more that the community that you represent can help us get better outcomes?
Stormy, quick response, and then I'll invite the panelists to provide concluding remarks.
Yeah, no, that is actually a really great point. And we are currently in a discussion among our members where we stand on the different proposals, and also where we can draw a line, because we are all, my members are, it doesn't come as a surprise, they are interested in research and development money, obviously. They are also very interested in international collaborations and the flow of information and data across country lines to ensure research. They also see that the European Union has some deficits with regard to infrastructure, which enables also innovation, and there need to be government funds going in there. So we are currently in a discussion, and I would say not all subsidies are bad, because you have the connotation of subsidy, you immediately think, oh, it's a subsidy is bad, but it can also be beneficial to others, not just within your country. We also were asked very quickly this question by somebody from the European Commission with regard to third markets. Can industry not provide more information where they see an unlevel playing field and unfair competition in third markets, like on the Chinese market? And I have to say, well, maybe the big ones, the big companies, but certainly not the big bulk of small, medium enterprises that's just way over their head. And in addition, what is always a limiting factor is how is this data going to be handled? This information going to be handled? Because if it's not confidential in the end, and if the evidence is going to be used with the name of the company behind this, you might lose your spot in that specific economy, because you're going after the government. And it's a little bit different when we talk about if we talk about dumping cases. There you are going against another company. So it's not that dramatic or sensitive. But if you go against another country, a company might think twice if it wants to throw its name in there.
Well, thanks very much, Stormy. So I'll go to the panelists one by one. Very quick concluding remarks. Let's start with Tim.
Thanks, Peter. Look, a really interesting discussion, and you know, I've really enjoyed hearing all the views. I suppose for me, I think there's no reason why we can't make things a little bit more concrete, sort of in terms of taking work forward. I suppose that's the key message I'd like to give. I absolutely agree. These kind of discussions are useful, and it would be wonderful, and we should continue to try and get an academic consensus. But I'm also very used to hearing here at the WTO, anyone that doesn't want to start a discussion to do the real work in, you know, the WTO or intergovernmentally, it's always because we don't have a consensus. This is too complicated. We need more information. And that can often be the case, but it's not an excuse for jumping in and doing something and starting some kind of concrete work, whether it's at the WTO or plurilaterally, using the G20. But I think that's the key thing, that I think all of these discussions are extremely useful. But for me, I think it's clear that there's improvements that need to be made. And I think we should be ready to jump in and do that and find a way to do that fairly quickly. Maybe it's something that the new DG will be able to look at and run with.
Ooh, any secrets to share there, Tim? I'll take that as a no. All right, let's go to Ken.
I've spoken a lot. Look, I would agree with Tim and even go a step further. There's an urgency to stop the chatter and begin to actually do some things and you know, inject some transparency. We can do this as academics, but I think institutionally it needs to happen in a much more urgent way than we've seen to date.
Great, thanks, Ken. Totally agree. Shin Kwan?
I still think that the academic society should and could play a more important role in the debate. Subsidies are firstly a domestic issue. They are public money from the people. They are supposed to be fully discussed internally. And members should decide firstly whether those subsidies are worthwhile. Then, of course, international discussions should be focused on the cross-border impact of those subsidies. So, but I think, as I said, the international academic society could play the role in both places, both internationally and domestically.
All righty, great. Thanks, Shin Kwan. Stormy.
I just want to end with a proposal. Why don't we write a chapter for the WTO on subsidies? Do a little bit of an open sourcing exercise out of it, and let all the trade economists and political scientists work on a chapter together, which we present. That would be a concrete input.
An excellent idea, Tim. I will take that up with you offline and involve you, Stormy, in that, as well as the panel. Nisha, concluding remarks from your side.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. And thank you very much to our discussants. That was a fantastic set of elaborations, unpacking of the key ideas, the key issues at hand, and has really enriched my thinking, and I'm sure the audience's thinking as well. So what I took from it is that there is a broad consensus on things like the lack of information that has to be overcome. As Ken said, how much and what impact are our current subsidies? Negative cross-border spillovers need to be dealt with. I think there's a general agreement on that. And again, the discussion of subsidies for legitimate social goals. There's agreement there, but I think the devil will be in the detail on that particular issue. Agriculture and services are also industries. Absolutely, they should be treated as that. I think China and Australia might have some common ground on agricultural subsidy reform. The G20 can play a crucial role in generating political momentum. Obviously, Tim had some caveats there in thinking about how that might work. But I think there was a fairly broad agreement that they can play a role. We just need to really maybe define that a little bit more. Burden of proof is currently excessive for actually taking cases against subsidies. I think there's a general agreement in the academic literature, Shin Kwan, on that one. But also, as Stormy pointed out, CVDs can be protectionist. So again, there's a balance to be had there. So I think there was a broad kind of coming together on those issues. One final point I'd make, and and Professor Tu raised this, and I think it's where a lot of important work needs to be done, is what do we understand is the role of the market and the role of the state? Because while the ASCM was developed under contestation between the EU and the US, which has a similar relationship to the current issue. So the US wanted stronger disciplines and subsidies. The EU wanted more scope for legitimate subsidies. Yeah. So there's a structural similarity. Take out the EU and put in China, and now you have a somewhat similar structural relationship. But dig down a little bit deeper and you see a deeper, different understanding between the EU and the US on the formal separation of the public and the private when it comes to the economic. Even if in practice we know there's a deep and long-standing relationship, that's exactly why there's a formal separation, because we're afraid of what will happen if you don't separate them. China has a different political philosophy behind that and a different practical organization where the two are fused. I think to get to the heart of any subsidy reform that's going to be amenable to the major players, there's a lot of important conceptual work done there to see where there can be overlap and see where there maybe has to be some sort of, I don't know, we'll say agree to disagree and a separation on that issue. So that's where I will leave it. But I have to say I've a lot of interest and thoughts running around in my head, and I've really, really enjoyed talking with everyone here today, and thank everyone for their time.
Well, thanks very much, Nisha, and thanks very much to our panel. You've really illuminated this discussion. It's the first of several to come, I think. This issue is not going to go away by any stretch of the imagination. And we look forward to taking it further with you in other forums. And thanks also to our attendees who've stayed the course. Thank you.